Seems like a lot of fun doing what you do.
Well, it is fun. It's it's an art. For some mysterious set of reasons, sound people are almost always thought of as being technicians, and it's really unfair and it's not accurate because most of our time is spent making artistic decisions about things. A sound designer has to make 100 artistic decisions about a given sound before he or she even plays that sound for a director. And then the director gives you input about what they want, and then you have to make more artistic decisions to try to figure out how to make the sound conform to what the director wants. But to think of a sound person as simply somebody who knows how to turn knobs or who knows what a decibel is or is purely an engineer is grossly unfair and inaccurate.
How many people usually compose the sound design team? Like, how many people do you usually work with?
Mm-hmm. That's something that digital technology has really changed. A really big film like Apocalypse Now in the 1970s would often employ 30 to 40 people just editing the sound for the film, editors and assistants, including the sound designer. Now, similarly, large films are done with a third that number or fewer. And it's because we can do things much more quickly with digital technology than we could with the analog technology of the 70s. So on a big film these days, my team, if I'm the supervisor on a film, will usually be somewhere between 8 and 13 or 14 people.
Wow.
You've mentioned Apocalypse Now quite a bit. Are there other films that you always point to as some of the best sound design films ever, that you have a top 5 or top 10 list of great sound design films?
Well, I certainly don't have an absolute top 5 list, but several of the films of Orson Welles, talking about older films, are wonderfully sound designed movies. I don't know, there's so many rushing through my brain at the moment, and they're not all American movies either. I think Once Upon a Time in the West, the
yes.
Joe Leone movie, is a classic movie for sound design, especially the first 15 or 20 minutes of it.
Yeah, I just recommended that, and I mentioned that specifically as being one of the films I point to as great sound design, along with certain sections of The Shining, and then certain sections of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, for some reason, really struck me as effective. So
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So yeah,
and a film doesn't have to be a 5.1 channel audio track or a digital film to have a great soundtrack. There are lots of monaural films that have wonderful soundtracks.
And what do you think of the term or the saying, a movie should be able to work without the sound, with the sound off?
Well, on one level, I think there's some truth in that. On the other hand, virtually nobody would be willing to watch a film with no sound. I think there's a grain of truth in it, but on a practical level, I think only the most extreme sound buffs, extreme film buffs would be willing to watch a feature-length film with no sound, unless they were maybe doing something else at the same time and only glancing at the screen occasionally. There's something magic that happens that's undeniable when you have moving visual images synchronized with a dynamic, changing soundscape that's unlike anything else. It's unlike any other art form. And when things work really well, the visual images feed on the sound just as much as the sound feeds on and kind of nourishes the visual images. And I think it's wrong to say that film is fundamentally a visual medium. I think that most of the people who say that don't really have a very deep understanding of how cinema works.
Does the MPAA take into account the sound when they're rating the film, or is that just the content that's on the screen?
They do take into account the sound, and in fact, sometimes we have to modify the mix of a film to get the rating that we want. Sound affects people very emotionally. Mm-hmm. it's been said that sound sneaks in the side door to the brain, which is
That's great. That's great.
Unnoticed, but so you don't, as you're watching a movie, you may not be thinking, oh, the sound is having this effect on me, and this sound is having this effect on me. You ascribe what's going on to what you're seeing on the screen, and maybe the actors. You're not thinking that a certain sound effect is having an effect on you, but it is. Mm-hmm. And we find very often that in an action sequence, if we make the gunshots quieter, it will get a PG-13, whereas it would have gotten an R otherwise.
That's that's another thing where I don't think people realize. I didn't even realize that, but that's a great thing to think about.
Yeah.
Now, you and I discussed this before in previous conversations, that great sound design doesn't necessarily mean loud gunshots and big explosions, although that's a lot of times when people notice the sound, but great sound design is more the music, the dialogue, and the effects working in harmony. Is that what you believe?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, working in harmony to serve a given story in a certain way. There's a film called The Black Stallion, which was produced by Francis Coppola at the same time he was doing Apocalypse Now. And it has an amazing soundtrack, especially the first 30 minutes or so of the film. It's about a little boy who discovers this horse on a ship on the Mediterranean. They're all crossing the Mediterranean, and there's a horse that's being transported on this ship, and the ship sinks, and the little boy and the horse wind up on this island together. And the sounds of the ship and the ship sinking and then the boy and the horse on the island and all the adventures that they get into on the island, with very little dialogue, by the way, and not a huge amount of music either. This magical soundscape was created by a sound designer named Alan Splett and the director of the film, Carol Ballard. And it's a film in which there's virtually no violence of any kind. Very little happens that you would classify as being loud, but it's emotionally powerful. It just pulls you along. The visual images and the sound pull you along in a very powerful way.
It is a great movie, absolutely.
Now, do you know the total number of films you've done?
Well, I think it's around 130 or 140
wow.
that I've worked on.
Now, have you also worked on video games, too? Is the sound design in video games similar to the sound design in film?
Well, it's similar in some ways and very unsimilar in others. I worked on Scarface, which is kind of at the opposite end of the violent spectrum from the Black Stallion.
Yes.
And
yes.
The issues are similar in that, in terms of video games relative to film, that it is, in the end, it's about storytelling, and I think games are beginning to use storytelling in more sophisticated ways than they have before. From a purely technical perspective, the two are very different, doing the sound for a film as opposed to doing the sound for a video game. And the video game sound is much cruder, much more primitive kind of process because of the technology restrictions that still exist in video games. I think that's going to change a lot over the next 5 years, certainly 10 years, because more video games will be coming out over the next few years that are about as high fidelity in terms of sound as